There's no one thing that makes someone homicidal or attack a person and decapitate them in one moment in time. I saw it in the news, I realised that was the same person that I'd seen. The details were fairly widely reported and quite horrendous, especially the fact that there'd been a decapitation and multiple stab wounds and the allegations against her at the time.
That's Dr. Richard Furst. He's talking about Jessica Camilleri, one of his patients who recently made headlines for decapitating her own mother. I'm crime reporter Amelia Saw, and this is Twisted Minds, a podcast about crime, mental health, and the experts trained to uncover just what makes criminals tick. Richard has sat down with hundreds of people who have committed truly horrendous crimes. The kind of crimes that make your blood run cold. One of those people is Jessica Camilleri.
Hello. Hello, this is Alison from Police Emergency. We just received a call from this number.
Yes, I need you to get the ambulance and the police out here immediately.
To which address?
128 St Clair Avenue. Please come. I need you. This is a immediate life or death situation.
Which suburb or town is that in?
St Clair.
Okay, so
That's the 000 call Jessica made to emergency services at around 11 p.m. on the 20th of July 2019.
My mum's tried to stab me and I killed her, I think.
So did she just say her mum tried to stab her?
I don't know because of the...
Yes,
Yeah.
with a knife. And in self-defense, I think I killed her. Yes. Can you tell them to come immediately?
Yeah, can you please just come immediately, please?
Okay, so she believes that she may have killed her mother?
Mum has had enough of me because I admit I've been a challenge and this ongoing thing's been going for months anyway. She had enough of me. She grabbed me by the hair and dragged me from my room all the way to the kitchen, and she got a knife and she tried to stab me with it, and I grabbed the knife off her because I thought she was going to stab me, so I stabbed her back. And I was so heated up with anger, I just kept stabbing and stabbing and stabbing her, and I took off her head. Her head is I ran to my neighbour, not this neighbour, my other neighbour.
When Jessica made the call, she was standing at a neighbour's house, barefoot, in a nightdress, and covered in her mother's blood. In the call, she says she killed her mother in self-defence, but it's important to note she later admitted to a psychiatrist that wasn't actually the case. Jessica used 7 different knives to kill her mother before she beheaded her, picked up her mother's head and carried it up the street. Details of the horror she inflicted were splashed across international news. But if you put the blood and gore to the side, what you're left with is one tragic, unsolved question. What makes a 25-year-old woman commit such a terrible crime? And how was it allowed to happen? One of the people who might have some answers is Dr. Richard Furst. Richard has been working as a forensic psychiatrist for the past 17 years and has become one of the most respected practitioners in his field. I visit him at his Sydney office.
So look, I've probably sat down with thousands of people over the years in this area, both in here, in people on bail and people in custody. So half the people would be on bail, coming to see me on bail, then the other half of the week might be in prison, and then often one day a week or one day every couple of weeks would be in court, so giving evidence around people I see, trial work, sentence work, that type of thing.
Richard might have seen thousands of offenders, but Jessica's case is one that stands out. You see, Richard actually met Jessica in his office long before she committed her heinous crime. Not only that, her mother Rita was sitting right there beside her.
A young Sydney woman has spent the night in hospital undergoing a mental health assessment, set to return to court today. She's accused of murdering her own mother, decapitating her in the kitchen with a set of knives, leaving behind a scene so horrific that psychologists have been called to help police.
The doctors deemed her well enough for prison and she was discharged into the care of corrective services. Now, 7 News has today learned disturbing new details about the murder, but those details are too terrifying, too graphic to be broadcast to you tonight. Friends, today...
There's no stepping away from the fact that this was a very horrific, a very significant attack.
Neighbours still in disbelief.
They was really good. They have a good relationship.
When Richard is not meeting his patients in prison, he meets them here, in his practice. It sits on one of the top floors of an old building overlooking busy Macquarie Street and Sydney's peaceful Botanic Gardens. I thought about the people who had walked up his steps before me. Murderers, accidental murderers, sex offenders, the delusional and psychotic. Just as the building didn't fit in, these were the misfits, the people who didn't fit in with their own society. Richard's office is clean and tidy, with white walls, high ceilings, and a giant window which captures a sweeping view of blue sky. At least on the day I visit. We sit side by side in two fabric-covered armchairs, a box of tissues on a small table beside us. Like all psychiatrists, Richard has strict rules of patient confidentiality. So he already asked Jessica if it was all right for him to speak about her today. She said yes.
I actually met her here in this room, first instance, in 2014, so it's well before the incident in 2019 that became the focus, like, in courts. So, and I met her mother as well. So she's I think she's one of two people where I met the mother who became a victim. I was thinking about that. And that was on a fairly simple charge, like a local court charge where she'd been aggressive towards her aunt, as I recall, and that was the first contact. And then I was contacted last year about this current case, like the trial that she had late last year and the actual murder of her mother in July 2019.
What were your initial impressions of her?
Then it was more that she had some learning difficulties, or she was like what we call mild intellectual disability, and had a lot of anxiety symptoms, and with symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder and some panic symptoms. And I think that for that kind of presentation at the time, it didn't seem too remarkable, and it was more ongoing psychiatric and psychological treatment that I'd normally recommend.
Jessica was born the youngest of two daughters and was raised by Rita and her father. From a young age, it became apparent something was very wrong with Jessica's development. She was taken to various doctors, psychiatrists and other health professionals. Diagnoses always seemed to vary, but included autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, schizophrenia, attention deficit disorder and ADHD. Her family was struggling so much that at one point, Rita even paid a medium $2,500 to get the demon out of her.
She's basically come through a period where things have been very difficult in her life, being bullied at school, not having high self-esteem, being quite isolated, having what we'd regard as autistic spectrum disorder and a lot of anxiety, OCD, and then being prone to, I guess, what's a build-up of anxiety and periods of what might be termed explosive anger, or like a loss of control, which had never been anything like this before. Like, it hadn't been anything of the level that happened a couple of years ago. The most she'd done in the past would be getting really angry and assaulting other kids at school, or grabbing a stranger in the street and pulling their hair, or someone in a doctor's surgery. So it was nothing of this level that had ever really happened before.
In the years leading up to Rita's murder, Jessica was charged with assault on 4 separate occasions. The attacks were generally unprovoked. They included pulling the hair of a supermarket checkout worker and another attack on a lady with a baby. But compared to a later crime, they seem like drops in the ocean. But on each of the 4 occasions, Jessica was referred to mental health professionals rather than being punished by the justice system. The first time Richard met Jessica and her mum, it was following an attack on her aunt. Jessica had grabbed her aunt by the hair and pulled her down a flight of steps.
It was just basically seeing her for that report and seeing her for recommendations of treatment, which she was receiving at the time. And then, as I said, no further contact for the following 6 years or so.
So imagine this. You've worked on a case, spent hours talking with a person, and when they leave your office, you think they're, well, okay. Then one day you turn on the TV and their face is plastered across the screen, accused of committing a bloody and brutal murder.
It happens from time to time, but not often. So in other words, it is still confronting, and I guess, like, having seen someone before gives you a different background on that person compared to the average person who might just think that's a horrific act, and it is, but I'm just saying they wouldn't have any idea of the background history behind the person. So I guess I'd be in a better position than other people to understand things to some degree by having the background.
The homicide she committed was fairly high publicised. Did you see it in the news? Was that your first knowledge that it had happened?
I did. So I saw it in the news. I realised that was the same person that I'd seen, and at that stage, the details were fairly widely reported and quite horrendous. That there'd been a decapitation and multiple stab wounds and the allegations against her at the time. I probably felt for both people, like for Jessica being in that situation and being in the situation she was, but more for the mum and the family having to go through that, because it's horrendous.
A vicious, brutal killing almost beyond imagination. That's how a judge characterised a Sydney woman's death at the hands of her enraged daughter, stabbed repeatedly, then beheaded. A crime that's seen the daughter jailed, but not for life.
There is no doubt that it's just a distressing scene. The police last night were given support from our welfare and our psychologists, and they're responding very well to, again, the professional job that they did, the support that we have provided, and that will be ongoing.
Rita fought desperately for her life. She suffered 90 defensive wounds.
And then when you met her again, what circumstances was that under?
That was on instruction of her lawyer and her barrister, in terms of before the trial, to look at her condition and look at potential defences around the trial coming up. And so the situation there becomes doing a psychiatric assessment, so meeting the person again and going through things with Jessica and the history and getting her version and reviewing lots of different documents.
I'm assuming that was in custody.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been to the women's prison and many male prisons in this state countless times. I guess it's a bit like going through security at an airport, to put it in a place or a situation people might relate to, where you have the screening and checks and that type of thing. So they're checking who you are and checking for identity and any potential weapons or drugs and that type of thing. And sometimes you have professional visits alone. Sometimes you have a mixture with other visitors who are coming in to see their friends or relatives. But overall, it's a fairly stressful type of environment compared to being here, for example. Like there's more intensity and there's more restrictions on time and access and security. And then you usually end up in an interview room with someone for an hour or so, or a couple of hours, depending on what happens.
And so here they were again, sitting opposite each other. But this time, Jessica's facing a murder charge, and the one person who would normally be by her side to support her is dead.
In this case, Jessica knows me from before and remembered seeing me, and I remembered her, so that was quite straightforward, and she was very upfront and has been throughout about what happened and her situation. Generally, most of us who are experienced can find a way relating to people, engaging, talking through things and understanding their current situation. It's usually just, I guess, letting people talk about themselves and their own experience, because most people in that situation have a lot to say, but they haven't had a chance to talk necessarily, and it usually works quite well that way.
Explain to us how a situation like Jessica's, a 25-year-old woman, gets to the point where she kind of attacks her mother and decapitates her. How do we get here?
Well, I guess that's probably the million-dollar question. I mean, I think the truth of that one is that there's a lot of different factors that lead up to that. So that's the first thing to say. There's no one thing that makes someone homicidal or attack a person and decapitate them in one moment in time.
We know that Jessica had an intellectual disability, autism, a rage disorder and severe social problems, which resulted in her being expelled from school and becoming isolated. But that was just the underlying layer of problems. Soon a more complex picture began to develop.
The second thing was more what developed in the years after I saw her. I think it was more of a very distinct obsessive pattern, like obsessive behaviour of calling numbers and reading meaning into numbers and seeing colours behind that, to the point that she'd end up calling people up to 100 times a day just based on what their mobile phone number was and some meaning that had for her. And that in particular caused problems for the person or people that were being called, and for the mother trying to stop her from doing that. So it was a source of conflict, as I understand it. And then on the other sort of factor, which I think contributed and which she says gave her the idea, was watching horror movies that involved decapitation and various like freaky kind of horror films that involved brutality towards people.
According to family, Jessica would spend hours on end watching her two favourite movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Jeepers Creepers, over and over again. When her sister tried to take the DVDs away, Jessica would get so mad that her mother had to return the movies just to restore the peace.
Personally, I think that someone who's like isolated from people, has a fairly low IQ, and watches horror movies all day is not a good recipe. The average person would know that without being a psychiatrist. And I just think that whole constellation fed into this moment where there was a sustained kind of conflict between her and her mother that exploded in the way it did.
I suppose what's particularly tragic about this one, and perhaps is common to several cases, is that her mother was obviously her main caregiver. This was a person who had really devoted her life to looking after her, and yet unfortunately that meant that she was the first person in the line of fire. I mean, there was obviously, as you say, a history of mental illness, but no real significant violent criminal history. So there was not really that many red flags that something like this was going to happen.
No, I'd agree with that. I think if you go back to the period up until July 2019, Jessica's history would be not dissimilar to a lot of people that were still out and about, living with family or living in care settings, and she wasn't using drugs, she wasn't going into psychiatric hospitals or anything like that. So there weren't that many red flags, and certainly no indication that the mum would be targeted in that way. I don't think it was premeditated, no one's suggesting that. It just, as I said, was probably a constellation or a combination of all these different factors that fed into that one terrible moment.
So would you describe it as just like a sudden kind of escalation of rage that was kind of an outburst and was over quite quickly, but in that outburst someone died, someone was killed?
I think the truth is probably a little bit more in terms of a sustained problem, like over maybe 24 hours, like stepping back to the phone calls and conflict with the mum over the phone calls and the care arrangements of the grandchild. There's a few things that were issues for a longer period, not just like a brief moment. I think at least a day, or at least several hours, including and then increasing on the day or evening in question, and to the point that the mum did call for help. Like, it wasn't like at that point that she just happened. She actually called for a home doctor to come and help her. So there were problems increasing steadily and surely on that day.
So when the doctor arrived at the house on the night of the murder, Rita told her Jessica was having stomach problems. That was at 9:25 p.m. The doctor heard Jessica on the phone to a fast food restaurant. Rita asked Jessica to hang up so the doctor could examine her, but Jessica ignored her. She kept talking to the fast food operator, trying to get the attendant to say, "I love you." The doctor waited for 10 minutes, but Jessica wouldn't get off the phone. Finally, seeing Jessica was showing no signs of stomach upset, the doctor gave up and left. Less than 2 hours later, Rita was dead, and Jessica was covered in blood, knocking on the door of her neighbour's house.
And I took off her head.
When police arrived at the house, Jessica asked them what can only be described as some very strange questions. Police recorded what she was saying on their body cameras. She said, "Can I ask, is my mum dead? Don't think I'm insane, but can't you bring her back to life?" So what do these questions say about her mental state?
Certainly at the time, I'm sure she was overwhelmed, overwrought, and had lost her senses. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. And I think that was probably more like and imagine fanciful thinking as to how this could be solved somehow once the reality was there. But there's various reactions, and that's just one possibility. And certainly now she feels terrible about it and feels very bad about what's happened to her mother, having spoken to her a few times now. As you said, she's basically killed her primary carer and her mother, and that's a terrible thing, and it's awful for everybody. I'm going to ask you again a $64,000 question. How do we stop things like this happening then? Look, I think that the best we can really do to prevent things is for people to provide, the best care they can and access services early, for families to seek help and not suffer alone. I'm not suggesting that this mother did suffer alone, because she asked for help and there were issues, but I'm just talking generally in terms of preventing not just this kind of crime, but all kinds of crime would be to have services that are more open, services that are accessible, helpful. Jessica's obviously got a range of mental health issues at play. At the moment she's in prison. Is that, obviously for community safety it's an appropriate place, but is that an appropriate place for her? Do you think she'd be coping okay? Look, I don't think you'd say she's coping okay. I think it's a struggle for her, and I've seen her a couple of times, 3 times I think, since she's been in prison. I think it's difficult because someone who has, particularly for someone like Jessica, who has well lower than average IQ, and these kind of problems with anxiety and OCD and interpersonal relationships, communication with the autism side. Prison's quite a scary place. It's full of criminals, to say the obvious, and it's often full of violent episodes and intimidation, and it's set up to control people and basically punish them rather than treat them. But now, having said that, there's a lot of therapy that goes on, so it's transposed into that. There's psychologists, psychiatrists, and care plans and corrective services, community corrections, doing all that they can in the circumstances. So it's a mix of punishment, suffering, should probably best way to put it, and then treatment.
Justice Wilson sentenced Jessica to a maximum of 21 years and 16 months in prison for the decapitation killing of her mother. Jessica was standing in the dock. She didn't react, but her family burst out into loud, audible sobs. You could even hear her sister yell out, "Thank you." After the sentencing, I phoned Richard. I want to know what he thinks of the long prison term and how he thinks Jessica will cope.
Hello?
Hello, it's Amelia. How are you?
Oh, hi, good, thanks, Amelia. How are you?
Good. What did you think of the sentence Jessica got?
Well, it was probably excessive compared to what I expected her to receive, but that's really a matter for the judge to work out on her own merits, or the merits of the case.
I know, obviously, we have to respect the judge's decision, but I wondered if she may be kind of ordered to go into a forensic hospital setting because of her many mental health issues. Was that something you thought may have been ordered?
Well, the forensic hospital would only really apply if she was found not guilty by reason of mental illness. And I know Jessica was reluctant and didn't want to go to a hospital, having spoken to her.
Do you think, given her mental health issues and developmental issues, that she'll be able to cope in a mainstream prison environment?
Well, I think that the coping is challenging for inmates with that type of clinical profile, both her personally and people with disabilities in general, just because of the harsh nature of prisons. They're not the most therapeutic environments, and there are challenges in prisons in terms of potential threats or intimidation from other inmates, and violence, which is quite commonplace, being exposed to other violent inmates. So those would be factors that would make things difficult longer term.
We also heard at her sentencing that she'd already been involved in assaults on other prisoners, and I imagine that it's once you put someone with the quite complex issues that someone like Jessica has in this really kind of, a melting pot of, a confined space with a whole lot of other people with very complex issues and obviously, criminal behaviour. It seems like it could only really escalate in behavioural issues for everyone.
Well, I think the issue goes back to some of the behaviour that was evident, say, in the schooling days or childhood, and that is issues of, say, bullying and teasing, and Jessica not being able to cope very well with that. So, as in being potentially easily triggered by comments that are inflammatory or put downs. So I suspect that's part of it, plus impulse control and the general stress you talked about all would go together towards that behaviour.
She would also, I imagine, because her crime has been quite high profile, I know in general those people are often targeted in prison populations, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Richard sent me an email this morning comparing this case to Christy Abrahams. In 2010, Christy murdered her 6-year-old daughter Kaisha. Then she and her partner Robert put the little girl's body in a suitcase and left it in their home for days. Next, they burned her body and buried it in a shallow grave. Christy even went on national TV and made a teary appeal asking for help to find her missing daughter.
With no trace of the little girl, her distraught mother made a dramatic appeal to the public for help.
If anyone has seen her, can they please contact the police?
At her side, the 6-year-old's stepfather.
Can't describe how it's been. You don't know until you put yourself in my shoes.
I thought it was an interesting comparison in that the sentence length was almost identical to Jessica's, like around 22 years, not just actually 22 years and 6 months in the case of Christy Abrahams and 21 years and 7 months total sentence for Jessica. And so just on the face of it, you've got murder getting the same sentence as manslaughter, both women pleading guilty to that. But beneath that, the more interesting comparison, I think, is to do with the heinous nature of the crime and factors such as the more deliberate killing of a person in the case of pleading guilty to murder, where you're intending to kill, as opposed to manslaughter, where that intent is not necessarily there, and also the other features around the case, like lying to police and media, and having the whole community search for that child for days and so on, puts, I think, a different slant on that case compared to what we're looking at here.
I can tell Dr. Furst has a real fondness for Jessica. He's able to see past the violence and the horrible crime she committed and see the person beneath. It's admirable. He might deal with death and violence on a daily basis, but he hasn't lost his compassion for people. He's not a bleeding heart either. When Richard needs to call someone out, he doesn't hesitate. And that's exactly what happened with Derek Barrett.
Police still don't know the identity of a woman found dead at Snapper Point on the Central Coast late yesterday. She was spotted floating face down inside the blowhole in the Lake Munmora State Conservation Area.
The 25-year-old was found naked in a Central Coast blowhole over the Anzac Day long weekend. She had been stabbed or slashed at least 30 times. Derek Barrett has admitted to murdering his niece, but today tried to play the victim at his sentence hearing, blaming his sadistic actions on drugs.
When Richard first met Derek Barrett, he had been charged with the murder of his niece, Meng Mei Leng. Meng Mei was originally from China, but like so many young people, she had a dream of studying in Australia. She moved in with her aunt and uncle in Sydney's inner west. It was a place she should have been safe. But Barrett developed a sick infatuation with her. The 27-year-old IT worker began filming her in the shower. He made tapes of himself masturbating over her while she slept. Then, in April 2016, while his wife was away, Barrett struck. He gagged Meng Mei, bound her to the bed and took photos of her naked body. Then he stabbed her to death, wrapped her body in plastic and put her in the back of his car. He drove off to dump her body, but he took his time on the way. He even stopped at a service station to buy a drink while her body was lying in the back of his car. Then he dumped Meng Mei's body over a cliff and into a blowhole. What was your involvement with this case?
So I saw him in 2016, in the months after his arrest, and that was in relation to his fitness to be tried and whether there's any mental conditions or mental illness that might have accounted for the alleged offence back then, which was in, I think, April 2016. Then I saw him again in 2017 after he pleaded guilty in terms of preparing a report for sentence in the Supreme Court.
So in terms of fitness to trial, that means that, you know, he's understanding the process and able to partake.
Yeah, so understanding the charges and the options in court and instructing counsel, understanding what's going on in court and taking part in a logical sense.
What was your impression of him when you met him?
Nothing stood out too much, like in terms of not having any major mental illness as such. So I was basically looking at his version of what happened and his clinical profile, and the only story he was putting forward from memory was about not remembering everything and not really understanding what had happened. That was what he was suggesting, and talking about some drug use at the time with ice and methamphetamines. So it was nothing really stood out apart from that. Like, he seemed, if anything, maybe slightly awkward or more into sort of IT computers by training. So nothing, didn't seem like an aggressive criminal type or anything like that, or an antisocial person, or a person with a major mental illness. But that was pretty much the initial impression.
I think for, as a member of the public, they're always the kind of cases that seem most quizzical, because they're the type of people that we all work with, or who seem just like ordinary people with professional jobs that are probably our neighbours, and then they go and do these acts that seem so shocking to the ordinary person.
I think it is scary when people read these kind of cases or hear about them in the media or in the courts, because it does seem like the person next door, and it would have been the person next door for people living in Campsie at the time, in that complex. And I guess it does speak to the fact that people can do some pretty horrific things based on their own fantasy world or distorted reality or desires, depending on what drives them in that way. And that's kind of the question that is harder to understand.
Barrett actually went as far as saying he couldn't remember the murder or dumping Meng Mei's body. He said he was so high on drugs, he blacked out, and when he came to, he was in the bathroom and there was blood in the sink. And he said all of that under oath at the Supreme Court. But Richard saw right through him. He told the court he thought Barrett was not telling the truth about his memory loss. How do you tell someone's faking amnesia? Are they a really bad actor?
That's a good question as well. I think that it depends on your experience and looking through documents, looking through evidence, and it's more hypothetical. Like, for example, if someone had really truly forgotten what had happened and they came to and saw a dead body in front of them, they normally call the police, or an ambulance, okay, or do something to try and help the person. They wouldn't necessarily put the body in their car and drive 100 kilometres or so and dump in a blowhole. So it's usually like the common sense thing that gives it away. Like, it's just not credible to say you don't remember what you did, but then you've done all this stuff afterwards to cover up.
Richard believes Barrett killed Meng Mei because he was acting out a depraved sexual fantasy. And it turns out he was right. But the police didn't realise just how twisted Barrett was until a couple of years later, when they made a startling discovery. 2 years after Barrett is sentenced, a USB turns up, and on it is a 60-minute home video of Barrett sexually assaulting Meng Mei. It's filmed from all different angles. You can see the contempt Barrett has for Meng Mei and just how frightened she is before she dies. And get this, the USB stick with footage of Meng Mei's murder on it is found in the hands of an old woman with dementia. The woman has no ties to Barrett and lives about a 15-minute drive away. Her daughter visits one day, sees the old woman clasping the USB and plugs it in, realises what's on it and immediately calls police. So, Barrett is sent back to court this year, but only ends up with an additional 2 years on his sentence. Richard says the term used to describe what he did is called sexual homicide.
So amongst the homicides that take place each year around the world, about 1% would be sexual homicides. So it's not common. So if you look at this state, there's maybe 75 to 100 homicides a year, so you'd expect one case, and that's been roughly what you'd see over the years. And within that group, because there's not that many people, we had to look at people around the world who've been incarcerated, and you tend to find people who are have deficits in their socializations. They tend to be what we call schizoid or isolated from other people, people who are have issues in terms of violent fantasies or lack of empathy towards other people, and often, in some cases, sexual deviance or sadistic type fantasies.
So, only 1% of the world's murders are sexual homicides. They're so rare that thankfully most of us will never cross paths with the perpetrators. It's just, in Richard's line of work, he meets a lot of that 1%. Take Vincent Stanford, for example. It was Easter Sunday, 2015, when he murdered bride-to-be Stephanie Scott.
Vincent Stanford, the man believed to have killed Leeton schoolteacher Stephanie Scott, has been charged with her murder. Police are still yet to locate the 26-year-old's body, but have found her car 8 kilometres away from her hometown in the New South Wales Riverina.
Vincent Stanford tells officers he couldn't stop himself.
I picked her up from behind with my right hand over her mouth and my left hand around her middle. I dragged her into the store.
For the aggravated sexual assault, you are sentenced to imprisonment for 15 years. For the murder of Stephanie Scott, you are sentenced to imprisonment for life.
The bubbly 26-year-old was due to be married to her teenage sweetheart, Aaron Wolseley. But 6 days before the wedding, Stephanie was murdered by Stanford, a cleaner at the same school where she worked. On Easter Sunday, Stephanie went into the school to prepare lesson plans for the relief teacher covering for her while she took time off to get married. Stanford was on a cleaning shift when he noticed Stephanie sitting at her desk, alone. So he went home, got a rape kit, then returned to take his victim. Stephanie, of course, had no idea what was about to happen. As Stephanie was opening the gate, Stanford grabbed her around the waist from behind. He put his hands over her mouth to muffle her screams. He pulled her into a dark storeroom, sexually assaulted her, punching her until she was unconscious, then killing her by stabbing her in the neck with a knife. When police caught Stanford and charged him with the murder, Richard was called in by the defence.
I did assess him in terms of the period after his arrest, and again it was mostly in terms of his fitness and whether he was able to be tried fairly, and in terms of any potential defences.
That is a particularly quizzical case, again, to a lot of us, because she seemed almost like a random victim. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. What's your understanding of that?
I think that's exactly right. I think she was in the wrong place at the wrong time because he was, as I understand it, cleaning on the weekend, and she'd gone to the school on the weekend where she wouldn't normally go to prepare for the next teacher taking over when she was having the wedding and honeymoon, and just came across a person who had like different and deviant ideas about sex and violence and probably murder.
Police uncovered that Vincent Stanford had been researching some alarming terms in the lead up to the murder. He searched phrases such as bride rape and bride kidnapping. But does this mean the crime was premeditated?
I do think that it was more a chance meeting between those two parties, and it could have been anybody else in Leeton or in the neighbourhood or someone else if you come across another victim, but that was more an opportunity. It doesn't mean that he was focused on her in particular, and it doesn't mean that he wasn't free of deviant thoughts in the period before that, because, as you say, there have been searches of internet and other issues that point towards that. But I think again, it's a terrible collision of different factors in being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person.
It is a frightening thought that, like Stephanie, you can go about your day like you always have, and then suddenly you find yourself at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. If murders like these are all up to chance and there's nothing we can do to protect ourselves, how likely are they to happen?
We're looking at about one case a year, maybe less than that, looking back through New South Wales anyway. It seems to be more prevalent in America, but maybe slightly higher in terms of serial killing, homicide, and cases that have attracted some notoriety over the years. But again, it's not common. It's far more common to have gun crime and murder, which is unrelated to any fantasies or deviance. There's probably a slightly higher rate of people with fantasies or deviant fantasies of a deviant type that don't act on that.
It's weird to think there's people walking among us, fantasising about doing horrible things to other people, but because they never act on them, none of us know. Dr. Richard Furst deals with the people who have taken action, the people who have pulled the trigger, raised the knife, ended a life. Of course, not all murders are planned. Some are calculated, others happen in a moment of fleeting rage. The most tragic are accidental. Next episode, we meet Dr. Karen Owen. She's one lady who knows a lot about sex offenders. Karen led the charge in bringing treatment for sex offenders to Australian jails. So why do we care if sex offenders get treatment in prison? Because most of the time, they come back out again. Catch you next time.